My name is Meredith Chilton, and I'm an independent ceramic historian. But for 20 years, I had the great privilege of working as the curator at the Gardiner Museum, and in fact of being the founding curator. So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite characters in this marvelous collection. He's called the Greeting Harlequin. And why is he my favorite? Well, for many reasons. First of all, it was perhaps one of the most important purchases made by George Gardiner, who started collecting ceramics without an idea of founding a museum, but then came to it. And some of the very earliest pieces that he purchased were Harlequin figures, because he had an association with Harlequin books, with Harlequin publications. And he was inspired to collect Harlequins as a token of his appreciation and of his time that he spent with Harlequin. But in fact, he had many other business interests. This is not his primary one, but we don't need to go into that. When Mr. Gardiner purchased his Harlequins, he decided to focus in on this aspect of collection. And so the collection of Harlequin sculptures at the Gardiner Museum is preeminent worldwide. There is no other specialized collection of this sort, and it is one of the iconic aspects of this museum. The Greeting Harlequin is a very special character. He was made at the Meissen porcelain factory in Germany in about 1740. And the Meissen porcelain factory was the very first factory in Europe to make true porcelain in the manner of the Chinese. Porcelain in the 17th and 18th century was considered an extraordinary, precious commodity. And its discovery in Europe, I would say, is rather akin to a discovery of plastic. It was incredibly important, it was a very rare material, and it was an extraordinary technical accomplishment at the time. The man who started it all was a man called Johann Friedrich Böttger, and he was an alchemist who worked for Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony, and later King of Poland. And the Elector of Saxony was mad for porcelain, and he persuaded, by force, young Böttger to come and work for him, initially to try and make gold, but then, in fact, he discovered porcelain. And when he did discover porcelain, with the aid of other people, Augustus the Strong started the Meissen factory in Meissen, which is just outside Dresden, in 1710. The Meissen porcelain factory introduced a mark for its porcelain in about 1725. This was to reduce the porcelain being used for nefarious purposes or being identified incorrectly. They could also use it as a quality control. So many of their pieces have got the cross swords mark in underglazed blue, and this sculpture has one just like that, but not all Meissen figures or porcelain has the cross swords mark. So you need to just look and make sure that what you have is right. A few years later, in the 1730s, there was a great sculptor who came to Meissen. His name was Johann Friedrich Kendler, and Kendler is the man who made the Screeching Harlequin. Initially, he was making large sculptures, almost life-size sculptures of animals and birds for one of the palaces of Augustus. But very soon, he noticed that, in fact, small-scale sculpture would be much better suited to porcelain. And he started making small sculptures, particularly of harlequins. Now, this harlequin is called the Greeting Harlequin. Well, you might be able to guess why. You can see he's bowing, he has his hat in his hand, and he's smiling at you. Harlequin is one of the characters in the Commedia dell'arte, which was a theatrical form that flourished first in Italy and then spread all through Europe in between the 16th and the 18th centuries. And the Commedia dell'arte had standard stock characters, each of whom was well known by its costume, its characteristics, and also just for the roles that they actually performed. And Harlequin was one of the most important characters in the Commedia dell'arte. He was a servant, he was a go-between, he was a rascal, he was the one who schemed between one lot of people and the other, who brought lovers together or who split them apart. He was always open for a bribe. He usually had a spoon in his pouch so he could get something to eat. But most of all, he was this flamboyant, wonderful character, instantly recognized by his costume, which, as you can see, is composed of scraps of material sewn together in diamond shapes, multicolored. So as soon as you saw him on the stage, you knew he was up to no good and you knew what he was going to be doing. It's curious because the Commedia dell'arte infiltrated many different aspects and levels of theatre in the 17th and 18th century, and particularly in France, where there was a troupe of comedians who performed for Louis XIV called the Comédie Italienne, and they in turn influenced Molière. And there is in fact a Harlequin dance in the Maladie Imaginaire, one of the great plays of Molière, and the music and even the notation for the dance survive. And when we look at the notations for this dance, it's the very earliest choreographies that we're seeing transformed onto paper. The choreography for the dance of Harlequin shows that the very opening moves that the Harlequin make is always to bow and to shake his hat. So you can imagine this Harlequin coming on the stage, bowing, shaking his hat and grinning at the audience. It's exactly what this Greeting Harlequin is doing. Furthermore, he's actually bowing in a very specific way. So when I was doing research on this piece, I was curious because he seemed to me to be bowing in an unusual manner. So I was able to consult a book on the way in which gentlemen should bow in the early 18th century, which was one of these handbooks for young men so that they could learn how to do things in the right way. And the bow that Harlequin is performing is called a greeting bow to the left. So he's looking across a street or across a theatrical stage at the other side, and he's bowing to the person on the other side. Now, part of the Commedia dell'arte involves little moments called lazzi. These are comic interludes, and the characters became very well known for them. I would say in the modern stage, the way in which Charlie Chaplin walks with his feet out and twirls his cane could be called a modern lazzi. So one of the lazzi that Harlequin is best known for is continually bowing at someone. So say he was observing a character like Columbine or Pantalone on the other side of the stage, he would start to bow, and he'd 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 bow. And after about 10 or 12 bows, it became extremely funny. And he would do this in almost every performance. And so once again, here we have, I think, the character of Harlequin performing a bow which is extremely familiar to his viewers. So the sculptor has chosen to portray him in a familiar pose to everyone who would see him, bowing at them. Now, Candler's figures like this, one of Harlequin and many of his other sculptures, were either used as pieces that were to be displayed in cabinets or on pieces of furniture, but also, and more frequently, they were used on the table. They were used to ornament the center of the table, and this ornamentation would usually stay there through the whole meal, but it would become awakened or enlivened during the dessert course. Though you can imagine then that there may have been many characters of the Commedia dell'arte, perhaps on a mirrored stand with little baskets of dainty fruits, sugared in pyramids, with little biscuits and candies, and all to really, in a way, to enliven conversation at the meal. Perhaps these figures appeared at a meal just before a masquerade ball, when in fact the ladies and gentlemen eating would have been dressed as Harlequins and Columbines. So you had this sort of mirror of life and theatre enacting itself together. I also think it's important to try and look at these pieces, if you can ever, when you're sitting down, because they're meant to be looked at table height. You're meant to be looking at them as if you're a lady or gentleman eating on splendid Meissen porcelain, something delicious that has been grown in the elector's gardens. And there in front of you is Harlequin or his friends, exactly at the right height for him to be looking directly into your eyes. So let's also look at his costume. Can you see around his neck, he's wearing a ruff. And these ruffs were almost always worn by theatrical personages at this period, or else by a lady or gentleman who's actually dressed for a masquerade. So if you're looking at portraits of people at this period and you see them wearing a ruff in the 18th century, when ruffs were no longer worn, it's because they're dressed up in costume. So here we have Harlequin with his ruff and of course his wonderful patched costume. It's been painted in many different colors. You can see that the jacket is different to the trousers, but that the diamond shapes predominate, and that there are gold lines on the costume which actually represent the seams of the costume, and a row of buttons down the front. Look at his shoes that have got pointed edges, and of course his wonderful grey hat. Every single hair on his head has been separately painted. And even look at his eyebrows and his eyes. They're so lively. You can see this is a real character that has been painted. Each example of the Greeting Harlequin is painted differently. There are no two alike, which makes them very interesting pieces to look at. Sometimes the painting is extremely bold, as it is here, and this adds to the quality and uniqueness of this object. And also Candler has used a method of foreshortening his figures. Can you see how long his back is, how short the legs are? It gives dynamic tension to the figure, and he was a master of this art. So Candler's great sculptures, which include this one, are considered to be some of the most important creations of the Meissen factory at this time. And the Gardiner Museum is particularly fortunate not only to have this great example, but also many others. It's really worth a visit to come and have a look at them, because they're set in a theatrical setting at the museum, and it's charming and enchanting to see all of these characters as you wander around. So I encourage you to come and meet the Greeting Harlequin and let him do a little bow just for you, and imagine yourself as if you're a lady or gentleman at this period, meeting him for the first time on the dining table or perhaps in the theatre.